My name is Janet Buning. I am the Vice President of Programs for Women's City Club and a former past president. And we welcome you all tonight to our program called Are Ohio Public Schools at Risk? And anyone who has read any news or heard the news on TV or the radio knows that, yes, indeed, there's a lot of concern about the state of public schools in the state of Ohio. With that in mind, we put together a panel tonight of three wonderful people. We have State Representative Dani Isaacsohn, who'll be speaking tonight, Katie Hofmann, who is a member of the Ohio Board of Education, and Bill Phillis, who is the Executive Director for the Coalition for Equity and Adequacy in School Funding, which means that he's involved in lawsuits regarding the voucher system. So before we get started, I just want to take a few minutes to, first of all, thank our speakers for coming, and thank you for coming to be part of this program. The speakers, well, Susan will tell you all that part, but I want to tell you about the housekeeping things tonight. We encourage anyone who wants to be visible to please do so. It's always more fun when you're the speaker to talk to faces on the screen, not little boxes with names in it. We do encourage you to keep yourself muted until the question and answer session in case there's any background noise. If you have any technical problems, you can put a message in chat. The program is being recorded in case you just now signed in and didn't hear that part. The program is being recorded. It will be posted on our website and YouTube for further viewing down the road. And what else do I need to tell you about? Pretty much that. Susan will explain the format of the program when she's going to be our moderator tonight. I think I've told you everything you need to know, except thank you again for coming. And before we get into the program, I would like to introduce our president, Jeff Dye, who is also our tech guru who's running the show literally on Zoom tonight. And Jeff will say a few words, and then he'll turn it over to Susan, and the program will begin.
To keep it brief, I'm Jeff Dye. I'm the president of Women's City Club. I'm really overjoyed to have such a good turnout for this. This is a very important program, and I think we've got a really good turnout of very interested people, and I'm looking forward to a very lively conversation. One event that's coming up is our annual Feist Tea, which is an event that we have every year in December. It's December 3rd on a Sunday, and we're honoring four people who I'm not going to name them all because I'm going to miss one of them or something, and that will be embarrassing. So I think it's going to be a great event, and looking forward to seeing some of you there. And if you're not a member of Women's City Club, I highly encourage you to join. But I don't want to take a lot of time with that. I want to introduce Susan, who is one of my mentors in the organization, and I'm so glad to know that she's going to be moderating because she does it so well. So Susan Noonan, take it away.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. It's good to see everybody. Thanks for being here. As Janet said, there have been some real significant changes made by the Ohio Assembly and Governor DeWine regarding public education, particularly the composition and the role of the Board of Education and the expanded voucher program. It's critical that all of us, people that are concerned about the state of education in our state, can hear firsthand from our panel participants, all of whom are integrally involved in the state of education in Ohio. Every public school system is affected. Doesn't matter where you live. So the program format is a panel with 15-minute presentations from each of our speakers, possible comments afterwards by State Senator Catherine Ingram, who may pop on, or David Pepper, who may pop on. So, and then after that, we'll have a Q&A period, which I know is the favorite part of the program for many of you. So first of all, our first speaker will be Representative Dani Isaacsohn, and he is the state rep serving his first term from District 24, which includes almost all, well, a whole lot of the city of Cincinnati, from Westwood, Price Hill, Fairmount, the West End, over the Rhine, Mount Auburn, Cuff, Walnut Hills, downtown, Mount Adams, East End, Columbia, Tusculum, and Mount Washington. So he has a huge part of Cincinnati. Dani is the son of immigrants, and he was raised to believe that the unique privilege of growing up in the United States comes with a responsibility to try to be of service to your community by empowering voices of people in the community and creating real partnerships between constituents and the community and elected representatives. So with that passion, he started his own business called Cohere, which brings together successful small community members and small businesses. No, I'm sorry. He started the small business which brings together community members and elected officials. So we are thrilled to have Representative Isaacsohn. Our second speaker will be Katie Hofmann, who is a retired teacher. She spent 37 years in private and public schools. She was a teacher leader in Cincinnati Public, many different roles, an activist with the Cincinnati Federation of Teachers, served various roles there, including vice president and secretary. She was a labor delegate to AFL-CIO and an AFL-CIO organizer in national, state, and local elections. Katie's been a precinct executive and district chair in Sims Township, and her public schools are affected, is president of the Northeast Democratic Club, and was elected to the State Board of Education, which we are interested in, November of 2022. And our final speaker is Bill Phillis, who will talk about the universal voucher system and the potential impact on our public schools. He's a retired state deputy commissioner of education who's dedicated to the preservation and improvement of public schools in Ohio. He's dedicated his retirement years to publicizing the harm that vouchers and charters can do to public schools. He founded the Ohio Coalition for Equity and Advocacy, and according to him, the Ohio State Constitution guarantees a uniform system of public schools, a commitment that he believes Republicans who control the legislature have violated. So those are our three speakers. We are thrilled to have them, and we're going to start with Dani Isaacsohn, who will give us an overview of what is going on in the state. We picked these two issues, by the way, knowing there were other issues, but we couldn't cover them all in one night. So Dani, it's all yours.
Pardon my interruption, but I forgot to mention something important about housekeeping. Please use the chat anytime you think about a question that you might want to ask. You don't have to wait till Q&A. Just put it in the chat and we will ask it in our question and answer session. Or if you just have a comment to make, but please feel free to use the chat function at any time during the program, and we will be checking that in responding to you later on. I'm so sorry. Dani?
Right, because we're going to answer all questions at the end of the program, so as not to interrupt the panelists.
Well, thank you so much, Susan and Janet and Jeff, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm very excited to chat with you all, although it's a subject near and dear to my heart, although I can't say it's a particularly happy one at the moment, but it's an important one for all of us to talk about. So just a little bit of background in terms of my relationship to this issue specifically. I am both on the Finance Committee in the House, the committee that sets does the budget, and specifically I was the ranking member, the lead Democrat on the education portion of the budget. So I became effectively in the House the lead Democrat on school funding issues this cycle. And so I'll tell you a little bit about kind of what happened. Some of it you might already know, some of it you might not, but I think it's both interesting and relevant. And then I'll get into the specifics of what happened as it relates to vouchers. But broadly, big picture, day one of the legislature this year, as you may or may not know, a very unique thing happened, which is that there was a little bit of a legislative coup in the House, and 22 Republicans of the 67 that are in the House broke away from the rest of their party and chose to vote with 32 Democrats to elect a different Speaker of the House than the majority of the majority wanted. And that, I say that because it's relevant to how it shaped the dynamic of what has happened since. Basically, those 22 Republicans became the chairs of most of the committees. They became the core of the Finance Committee. And they couldn't get to 50 votes in the House without Democratic votes for most of the year, certainly for the part of the House part of the budget. And so that's the context of how we went into the budget negotiations and the budget process, which is that they needed votes from the Democrats to pass anything. So and I tell people this, and I really mean it, for me as someone who's in my first term, the way the budget process worked is kind of how you want government to work, which I don't say lightly in the Ohio legislature, but the majority was in charge. They set the agenda, but they negotiated with us, they communicated with us, they compromised with us on the big issues. And so now this is through April. Things shifted when things went to the Senate, which is not like that at all. But in the Ohio House, it genuinely was, for me, a process I was really grateful for. And the big items within education in particular were around what we're going to talk about tonight, which is vouchers, how to expand them, how much to expand them, who to expand them for, whether we were going to continue what's known as the Fair School Funding Formula, which was negotiated 4 years ago, started 2 years ago, and is the new formula for how we fund our public schools. Not only whether we were going to continue funding it, but whether we were going to fund it up to, so the way the original deal was struck is over 6 years, it will be fully funded with 16.7% each year. So the question was, are we going to fund years 3 and 4? And then the question beyond that was, if we're going to fund years 3 and 4, are we going to update the formula to reflect what has happened with inflation? Basically, are we going to change the cost inputs in the formula? And I'm not going to get into the whole formula, although if people have questions about it, I'm happy to answer it because it is interesting. But that was the sort of billion-dollar question: was do we adjust for inflation and change the cost inputs to fiscal year 22, and do we continue the Fair School Funding Formula for years 3 and 4? I will tell you the majority of the majority would not have done either of those two things. But that became our number one ask, our number one demand as Democrats, that we both continue the formula and we do it in a way that actually reflects the actual cost of what it costs to educate a child this year. And that formed the basis for sort of everything else. Our second kind of highest priority demand had to do with home health care and direct service providers and Medicaid reimbursements. So a separate conversation. But within education and kind of overall, that was the top one. And what ended up happening was we successfully got that increase. It's a 12.7% increase statewide for public schools, close to 19% for Cincinnati Public. So a historic increase in public school funding. But what I always remind people is we're starting in a deep hole, right? So at the best case scenario, that got us to flat. But we have a long way to go before we're actually getting back to where we were when Strickland was governor, which, by way of comparison, when Ted Strickland was governor, and by 2009, Ohio was in the top 10 school education systems in the state and rising rapidly. And then we had a change in governor. We had a change in education funding policy. We massively cut education funding. And we're now in the mid-30s and falling rapidly. And so what this budget did, hopefully, was at the very least stop the bleeding in public education funding and stop the fall. But of course, the big compromise was around private school vouchers. And leading up to this year, and Mr. Phillis knows this way better than me, so I won't try and explain it too well or too in depth. But up until this year, most of the vouchers over the last decade or decade and a half were dedicated towards people who lived in failing school districts and or met a income threshold that was pretty low to qualify for state support to send their kids to private schools. So basically, everyone who lived in like my district, for example, in the city of Cincinnati, and wanted to send their kid to a private school qualified for a voucher because they lived probably close to some of the CPS elementary schools or neighborhood schools. And so it was already those people who wanted the choice, right? It's all about school choice. Those people who wanted that choice, it was already baked in most of our urban districts over the last decade or so, which is why I push back on the school choice language in two ways. One is the choice was already there with vouchers. We did not need to expand vouchers to give them the choice. Parents already had the choice. Two, a real choice means you're choosing between an excellent public school and what your other options are. And until we have well-funded excellent public schools, it's not a real choice. And so if you're really about school choice, that should be your first priority, because that's where 90% of Ohio's students go. So what ended up happening was they wanted a backpack bill, which is what some other states have done. It's what the Senate wanted. It's what the majority of the majority wanted. And the backpack bill is basically the money for the student. Let's say I'll give you a round number, $10,000 per student that the state spends on education would go with the student. So the parent could choose to use the $10,000 wherever they wanted. Homeschool, private school, charter school, public school. So that was their North Star. And our North Star was fully funding public schools and not expanding any charter funding or vouchers. Where we landed was somewhere in the middle, probably closer to their side, but not all the way, which is we got that massive public school increase, which we never would have gotten otherwise. And ultimately in the Senate, they took our voucher system and they quadrupled it. And they created a universal voucher where anyone in the state of Ohio now qualifies for at least some state funding, even if you're a billionaire, even if you live in the best school district in the state. And because the voucher amount is tied in the funding formula to the amount that we spend on public school students, when we increased public school spending, we also increased the amount of the voucher. So the number I like to share with people is that we are now spending on high school students whose families earn less than 450% of the federal poverty line, which is about 70% of people in Ohio. It's most people. For those students, almost all of whom were already enrolled in private schools. They're not making the switch. This is a subsidy for pre-existing private school families. They now get about $8,000 in direct tuition subsidy, a little more, plus an additional close to $3,000 in auxiliary spending and transportation funding. So the state is now spending on a majority, or could be spending on a majority of private school, high school students in Ohio, $11,000 per kid. Give you an example, the state spends about half of that on most public education students because so much of it comes from the local. So we're spending almost double from the state per pupil now to subsidize pre-existing private school students. So that is sort of where we landed. It costs over $1 billion. It's going to cost way more than they thought it would because schools have aggressively pursued this. Schools are going to increase tuition, which is what the market demands. Of course, they're going to do that. If you tell anyone your customers now just got extra money, you say, okay, great, they get to keep some, we're going to capture some. And we're seeing that happen, and people warned about that happening. So that is sort of where we landed. And I'll just close with what comes next in this movement for us. We obviously lost the charter school funding or the private school funding battle this go round. We compromised in exchange for the public school funding. But what we also didn't get, we didn't get any transparency or accountability for that money. So not only is the state spending huge amounts of money on private schools, but those students don't take the same tests as students in public schools do, so parents can't compare results. They don't have to accept anyone who applies. They can discriminate against people who are low income. They can discriminate against people with bad test scores. They can discriminate against people who are in wheelchairs, right? There's no metric of accountability for those private schools on who they accept, even though they're taking so much state money. And we don't actually know how much money each school is getting or how they're spending it because they don't have the same audit requirements. So that the next push for us is going to be on transparency and accountability. If you're going to be getting all of this state money, we need to know how it's being spent. You need to be required to accept students and not discriminate against students because you're taking public money. And those students need to be evaluated in the same way that other students who are receiving public dollars are evaluated. And I do really think, by the way, that if everyone got to vote honestly, all of those things would pass tomorrow in the House. Because most Republicans represent rural areas that don't have private schools. So this is the thing I shared with them all the time. All of the private school parents are in my district or in districts like mine in Cincinnati and Cleveland. I have the third most in the state. The top 10 are all represented by Democrats. Only 2 of the top 20 have Republican representatives. All of the private school parents live in Democratic districts. And so why did the Republican leadership, who mostly come from Southeast Ohio, send billions of dollars in subsidy for parents who live in our districts? And trust me, they did not want to. They don't have private schools. They're not interested in private school vouchers in those rural areas. So there is an appetite to try and at least rein some of this in. So I told you it wasn't going to be a particularly happy story tonight, although I am very proud of the public school funding increase. But I just wanted to share some of that context with you, and I'll with 2 minutes to spare,
Thank
some
you.
more Q&A.
Thank you.
You actually have 4 minutes because we started 2 minutes late. So if there's anything else you want to add, you may do so.
No, I'll reserve more time for Q&A.
Okay. Well, one question, not to jump ahead to the question and answer session, but someone wanted to know where online they could find the funding formula that you referenced. Is that something you can tell us, or is that complicated and you can tell us later?
I will, while I'm listening to the other speakers, I will find the link where you can find the formula. It is a complicated formula. I can give you the 30-second version, but the real version is took me at least a long time to learn.
Yeah, people wanted to be able to see it and look at it because we understand it's complicated. Thank you. Sorry, Susan.
Katie, you're next.
Good evening, everyone. It's been a whirlwind, all I can tell you. I was elected last November, and not 2 weeks into being elected, in lame duck session, Senate Bill 178 was presented. And from what I understand, historically, it's always been there. And it's been hanging around for 30 years that they wanted to pull this out of their bag and take over control of the state school board. But in the lame duck session, they threw it into lots of things at the last minute, and it didn't get passed. So I got my first orientation in January 9th. I was sworn in on January 10th. Not 15 minutes after I was sworn in, Senator Brenner, who's the head of the Senate Education Committee, came on in and said he was going to do everything in his possible way to take over control of the state board and the Department of Education. He didn't care how it was going to happen, whether it got through the Senate, whether it got through the House. If it didn't get through that way, then he was going to put it in the budget bill. So he put us on notice that very first day that I was there. I was kind of shocked, didn't really quite know what it was all about. After he left the room, we went on with board business. Our interim superintendent, Stephanie Siddons, who was doing a really remarkable job, did what all school boards are supposed to do. We started with a strategic plan. We looked at the data we had. We looked at the budget to make sure that the budget was matching up with the priorities of the board and everything that's being done. And then we went ahead with our teacher licensure and our teacher conduct and any rules that needed to be adjusted. That's a normal meeting. The next meeting, Bill Phillis actually came to speak about this issue, and Brenner heard that Bill was there, so he showed up. And after Bill's presentation, Senator Brenner kind of went on a diatribe about everything that the state board's gone wrong, everything that's gone wrong over the past 20 years. And at the end of that, the only thing that Bill Phillis said was poppycock. Well, that really set the senator off. And then Teresa Fetter, who was also elected at the same time I was, who was the ranking Democrat on the Education Committee for years with Brenner, challenged him, said, okay, over the past 20 years, these are all the things that you all have been in control of, and you haven't done this. And he got really very angry and said, and this is, you got to understand this, we want to be like Florida. So he laid out for us exactly what they were thinking. So from then on, we knew what his agenda was. So the very first thing he did was present Senate Bill 1. And from January through April, there was There was lots of testifying that was being proponents and opponents of Senate Bill 1. And in one of the hearings that I presented at, I mentioned that in 1953, the people of Ohio voted by constitutional amendment to take the State Board of Education out of the governor's office, to make it nonpartisan. And Matt Hofmann said to me at that time, well, we think the voters got it wrong, so we're going to correct that, which was really startling to me, that they would take a constitutional amendment led by the people and totally disregard it. So when Governor DeWine presented his budget that we had worked on, the education budget, there was no Senate Bill 1 in that budget. But the Senate Education Committee, even after they had many opponent testimony, they voted it out of committee, and the Senate voted right down party lines to pass Senate Bill 1. It was sent over to the House. It never made it out of the House committee. So the House never, ever moved on Senate Bill 1. So when the House sent their budget on over to the Senate at the end of April, Senate Bill 1 was not part of it. And when it got to the Senate, that's when it got bad. Dani Isaacsohn just said. That's when they started putting all the things in there. And at the very last minute, in the conference committee, they threw Senate Bill 1 in there, the very last minute. When we came for our July meeting, we had just found out that it had passed. We had just found out that Senate Bill 1 was in there. And what Senate Bill 1 originally was about 2,600 pages. What made it in there was about 1,200 pages. So at our July meeting, we really didn't know what was in that Senate Bill 1. We didn't have an August meeting. But after that July meeting, all the elected members of the state board got together afterwards and started talking. What are we going to do about this? So we started investigating. Our very first question was, is there anything constitutional that was wrong about this? Is it anything that we can sue on? And so we finally found constitutional attorneys, and they came up with 3 things that they believe were violated. Senate Bill 1 being put into the budget. And so those 3 things are, number 1, single subject. In a budget bill, you cannot throw something in there that really doesn't have to do with the budget. This has to do with the takeover of power. Didn't have anything to do with the budget. The second thing, it did not have 3 hearings, and that's constitutional how it has to have 3 hearings before these things can be enacted. But the third and the most egregious thing is the fact that this was a citizen-led voter constitutional amendment that to completely destroy what the voters in Ohio said in 1953, they threw it in the budget bill because that's the only way that they could get it done. Recently, a poll has been done, and 76% of the people in Ohio, all ranges of voters, in and out, private school, non-private schools, are in absolute opposition to what is being done. But they didn't care. They did not care. So we had no choice except to, on the September meeting, to file this lawsuit. We knew it was going to get dropped one of the days, either on the 18th or the 19th. But we didn't know how bad this really was until that September meeting, when Paul LaRue, who's the president of the board, and Martha Manchester filled us in on the fact that during the 2019-2020 year, the legislature was running out of money. So they went and took $10 million from the teacher licensure fund. Now, when DeWine sent his budget, that $10 million was restored to the teacher licensure fund. When the House sent their budget over to the Senate. That $10 million was included in the budget. However, the Senate took it out. So what they sent to us was basically all the work that we have to do, all the employees we have to have, all the wrap-back services, the attorneys, all technology, everything. And they made sure that by 2025, the teacher licensure fund would be bankrupt because they knew exactly how much money was in there. They took $10 million away. And so Brenner comes in the September meeting, and you better watch how you're spending your money. And we're not going to give you the money back. So this was really problematic for us. Everybody's wringing their hands together and saying, what do we do? What do we do? And they got very angry with us that we went ahead and did this and got a temporary restraining order, so much so that they refused to allow us to have a meeting in October, even though 11 of us did meet, and they, of course, disavowed our meeting. It's just the most aggravating thing to run for office when you think you can make a difference. Right now, the only thing that we are is a licensure committee. That's all we are. We do get to select a new superintendent, but that superintendent is only going to be over teacher licensure, teacher effectiveness, and teacher discipline. That's a lot of money for somebody for that limited amount of responsibility. And in our last meeting, it was very interesting. Nobody talked about the strategic plan. Nobody talked about budget. Nobody talked about looking at data to decide where we're moving forward, because that is now behind the wall at the Department of Education and Workforce Development. It's astronomical. Even with the temporary restraining order, the Department for Exceptional Children, which is the department that handles all of our special ed and gifted money that comes in from the federal government, it was completely disbanded. All of a sudden, their data was gone. All of a sudden, their budgets were gone. They had nothing. Completely disbanded into now the Department of Youth and Children. So nobody's going to be monitoring what they're doing with the money. And of course, they're not monitoring anything that's going on. From what we understand, the department has been in kind of a mess because since the budget went through, there have been 1,000 applications a day for the Ed Choice vouchers. So that's what they've been doing with just about 100% of their time. And now they've just selected a director for the Department of Education and Workforce Development. Has not been approved by the Senate yet. But in the meantime, Jessica Voltolini who was the chief of staff. She is now over the Department of Education and Workforce Development, not an educator. And so we are really in a state of limbo going forward. We did not get the temporary injunction, but the case is still moving forward on the 3 constitutional issues. The only thing that the defendants basically said on this was that they do not feel that the people who sued had any standing or had any right to hold the governor accountable for this Senate Bill 1, because they basically said he was elected, he can do whatever he wants to do. So that is the only argument that they have come up with. And by the way, through this whole thing, the Attorney General's office actually got dismissed from the case because of ethics violations. So there's no telling what's going on and what has been going on behind our backs. But we know that there's a wall. We had a meeting on Tuesday, and we were talking about the financial literacy course. Someone asked a question about, well, are any of our pre-service teachers getting any information from higher ed? Well, there was no one from higher ed in the room to be able to answer that question. Then someone asked, well, what does the curriculum look like for this course? There was no one there from curriculum. And there's not going to be anybody from higher ed, and there's not going to be anybody from curriculum to answer these questions. That's all behind the wall over at the Department of Education and Workforce Development. So right now, we are a teacher licensure committee. Is not what the State Board of Education is supposed to be.
That is outright scary. Wow. Thank you, Katie. I'm sure there's going to be some questions on that at the end, but we'll hear from Bill Phillis next, and then we'll go to Q&A. And I know there's already some questions in the chat. Says everybody's chat's working, mine isn't for some reason. Is yours, Janet? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Bill, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
All right. We can see you and we can hear you. I know you can't see us, but we can hear you and see you.
Well, first of all, thank you for allowing me to participate in this prestigious meeting this evening. Let me make a comment about the State Board of Education. I had the privilege of working for the elected State Board of Education from 1976 to 1992. The elected board protected us from the political winds, of Ohio. And we were able to concentrate on education issues. All the people in the Department of Education at the time had to meet strict criteria for employment. And we just didn't hire people that were just of political nature. So I just want to say that out at the outset because it was a great privilege, and we did great things because we were insulated. The elected State Board of Education insulated us from the politics of it. Before I get into the impact of vouchers, let me just at the outset emphasize 2 points. One, there was an economist in the 1950s by the name of Milton Friedman. He come up with this voucher idea. Possibly other people had come up with that idea before that, but he promoted the idea that the government has no role in education except to provide a voucher for parents to take to a private school. Now, later in his life, in 2006, speaking before the American Legislative Exchange Council, that's ALEC, he said that government should have no role in public education, that each parent should find their own educational program, and the government shouldn't fund education. Now, I mention that because that's where we're headed with regard to the voucher system. The puppet masters, the people that are really pulling the strings with regard to vouchers in Ohio and across the nation. In Ohio, and let me emphasize it, in Ohio and across the nation, those puppet masters are working toward getting government completely out of education, having parents fund their own education, the education of their own children, and finding a place to have them educated. So that's number one. They make no mistake about it. The question was something like, are the vouchers an existential threat to public education? The answer is yes. And it all started there with Milton Friedman, that libertarian economist back in the 1950s. Secondly, as you all know, and as Dani would know for sure, elected officials take an oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the state of Ohio. That Constitution of the state of Ohio provides, in pertinent part, Article 6, Section 2, which says that the General Assembly shall make such provisions by taxation or otherwise as will secure a thorough and efficient system of common schools throughout the state. Now, that was put in the Constitution, although the common school program in Ohio started in 1821 and was further enhanced in 1824, and then kind of hobbled along until 1850, 51, the constitutional amendment, when they put in the Constitution that provision that the state is required to have a thorough and efficient system. From my perspective, after 6 decades in education, starting being a teacher, a principal, superintendent, local superintendent, county superintendent, JVS superintendent, assistant superintendent of public instruction, and having made a somewhat thorough study of the history of education and the provisions for education, it's my opinion that Ohio never has had a thorough and efficient system of common schools. The court ruled in 1997 we don't have a thorough and efficient system. The Cobb-Patterson Fair Funding Program is coming close to having a thorough and efficient system or a constitutional system, but not yet. It's not yet been perfected. So, as the representative indicated, the universal voucher system will let Les Wexner, the most wealthy billionaire actually in the state, would allow, if he had kids of school age, it would allow him voucher money. That is taking taxpayer money to support somebody's private choice. The universal voucher program is a rebate program, as was explained earlier by the representative. In other words, people that are already paying for their tuition, we're going to spend another $1 billion a year for for those that have already paying tuition to private schools. Now, that estimate of $1 billion could be a lot more than that. And this, for example, in the state of Arizona, they projected an amount that the universal voucher program would cost, but then when it was really implemented, the amount was so much that some people thought that the state of Arizona was going to be bankrupt as a result of as a result of the people taking vouchers. Now we need to remember that private schools are already getting a ton of money. They're getting it through administrative cost reimbursement, through auxiliary services, and of course the public schools are saddled with transportation. Now you can imagine how much more it's going to cost the public school districts to transport kids to various existing private schools and those that'll be starting up. You know, wherever there's money, there's some people looking to get a hold of that money. So there will be new private schools crop up, and the Senate President Matt Hofmann is already talking about a bill to provide capital funds for private schools, particularly in the rural areas. He believes we ought to be using public money to build buildings for private school providers. And then, of course, we have on in other legislative initiatives, the tuition tax credit program, the education savings account program, and these are programs that will heap money in addition to the vouchers, heap money on the private school industry. This voucher program began, really at the behest of it started with in terms of the political aspect, it started with President Reagan, who had this, he issued this national report on Nation at Risk, which was a hoax, was an absolute fraud. And when he received that report, he said he was glad that they put in that report vouchers and those kind of things. Well, the report had said nothing about vouchers, but he was there promoting vouchers. Now, George Herbert Walker Bush, that's Bush 41, came to Ohio on November 24, or rather November 25, 1991, and I was in the audience, and he was at that time saying that Ohioans ought to give a voucher to every kid in the state. Now, at that time, the public didn't have appetite for vouchers for every kid. And so George Voinovich, the governor at the time, who was in sync with George Herbert Walker Bush and an industrialist by the name of David Brennan, but those three, the president of the United States, the governor of the state, and an Akron industrialist, all got together and decided that we should have a voucher program. They couldn't get much traction in the legislature at the time, so they picked on Cleveland School District. Cleveland School District at the time was having real serious problems, and so everybody was, picking on Cleveland. And so they crafted this little program to allow some Cleveland kids go to some of the private schools in the Cleveland area. They could have gone to suburban districts, but the suburban districts didn't accept them. So they went to the private, or they went to the private schools. Now, the data show that there's no academic reason to be sending kids to private schools, because the tuition students, the voucher students, do less well than the peers back in the public school district. So there's no academic reason to give kids a voucher. And of course, the voucher people think, or advertise that the private schools are better. But when you control for demographics, the public schools outperform private schools every day of the week. Now, it's been said before on this program that the voucher schools don't have any audits. They're not regulated. And I understand that there might be some moves on to regulate the private school industry, but don't count on that with the kind of legislature that the lopsided legislature that we have today. Public schools have been underfunded since the beginning, but yet they perform better than most private schools that we have in the state of Ohio. Now, so what's my coalition doing about this? Well, on January 4, 2022, we filed a suit challenging the constitutionality of the school voucher system. We went to the court with 5 claims, 5 counts, and it's just really, I think it's very compelling that the judge not only rejected the state's motion to dismiss, but allowed the case to go forward with all 5 claims that we're making intact. Now, we have, at this point in time, we have 250 districts that are currently involved in this litigation. Districts pay a membership fee to participate, but 250 districts not enough. We need all the districts, and all the districts in the state of Ohio ought to be interested in this, because eventually vouchers will in fact destroy the public education as we know it. We'll always have a public system, but it'll be like the State Board of Education was relegated to just a couple of duties that are important, but certainly not the core of the functions that the state should manage as far as the education system is concerned.
Okay, Bill, this is the warning you asked for, the 5-minute warning. It's
Okay,
actually 4 minutes at this point. Okay, sorry to interrupt.
I'll be finished before the 5 minutes.
Okay.
Additional time. The bottom line of this is that
Yes.
we won. I was involved in helping to win the school funding case back in 1997. Nobody thought we could win. The legislature was lopsided in terms of one party. The legislature, all state officials were fighting it. But 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. The 2 Democrats in the court and 2 Republicans on the court. 2 of the 5 Republicans on the court at the time joined forces and ruled against the state. We believe that our case is so compelling that we're going to win this. You know, the state of Illinois legislature just, I think in the last week, might have been previous to that, but in the last week or so, dropped their voucher program. They didn't renew it. And so, you know, there's that gives us hope that maybe the tide might be turning with regard to this whole idea of privatizing the public system. People don't believe that there are those out there nationally and in the state that want to completely privatize the public system. I've read the literature. I'm not reading the tea leaves. I'm just reading what's going on in America. And I'm here to tell you that the goal of the puppeteers in the voucher industry have in mind destroying the public education system, except for taking care of those with disadvantagement and those that are involved in with some handicap. The private people don't want those students because it costs more to educate, and so they want to use the money they're getting for vouchers for other things. That I'll stop at that point.
Okay, thank you so much, Bill. I did want to mention to you all that Dani Isaacsohn did put all of the links in the chats for resources on school funding in Ohio. And I'm going to start the Q&A by asking our panelists if any of you have any idea what Mr. Dakin's views on education are since the governor appointed him today, or I guess he still has to be confirmed, of course, but do any of you know anything about him?
What I do know, this is Bill. What I know about him is he's always cozying up to the party in power.
Huh. Well, that's a good fact to know.
Okay.
That doesn't make me feel real confident. Katie?
Well, what I know about him, he was the vice president of the State Board of Education. He was responsible for the superintendent search. He was the one that looked at all the applications of everyone that was applying for the job. Then he resigned from the state board and applied for that job. And the state board selected him to be the new superintendent. And he was only in that position for 11 days before he was called up on an ethics violation. Now, we find it very, very interesting that now he's the one that's selected for the director of DO. We find it very interesting and probably questioning whether that was a setup all along to make the state school board look incompetent. That this was set up from the very beginning to make us look bad, to justify their establishment of the Department of Education and Workforce Development. And I want to find it during that 11-day process is also when he recruited Jessica Voltolini into the Department of Education to be the chief of staff. She was the only person from the ODE that testified in the hearing on our lawsuit. And she basically lied on the stand about what the real role of the real role was going to be from the state board. She kept saying, well, some of their abilities have been changed. Well, it's actually dramatic changes of what the state board does now. And I find it very interesting that she was brought in by Dakin, and now she's the interim director of the Department of Education and Workforce Development. So, Ohio's been called the most corrupt state in the nation. This is just one more layer of corruptness.
Well, Dakin was an appointed member, right?
Correct.
And Dakin, that chief of staff was probably somebody in state government, probably assigned her to that position.
That's right.
Mhm.
Okay. Do you know anything about him, Danny? Or do you have any
No,
idea?
in a very different context, I had lunch with him probably 5 years ago, but can't speak to his views on education or what he's going to be like as a director.
Okay, so Janet, do we have any questions in the chat?
We do, Susan, and I just want to share my increasing gloom and sense of gloom and doom about the future of education, that it sounds like it all has to go to the proverbial in a handbasket before it gets better. But here's a good question from Brian Jarvis. He posted or asked the question, so far, there has been no explicit mention of the DeRolf versus Ohio decision regarding the funding of public schools. Do the speakers feel that the voucher program violates that decision?
Well, I'll begin the conversation by saying absolutely. Now, I remember that we got 1,200 new school buildings out of the DeRolf decision. The state was so embarrassed with regard to the condition of school buildings that they did develop a program there. But on the operating side, the DeRolf decision forced the state to go from 34.5% of its budget to over 40% of its budget for assigned to education. However, the additional percentage of the state budget, general revenue fund budget of the state going to education was lost to the K-12 districts because it was siphoned off with regard to private school funding. Since 1997, since the first DeRolf decision in 1997, this state has allocated from 25 to $30 billion to private school direct funding, charter schools, and vouchers. Almost $30 billion, which everything we gained with regard to DeRolf in terms of the operating side of the budget, we've lost to privatization.
Wow. Oh, and the doom and gloom increases. Yes. Yeah, it's we had last year in February, I think, or actually it was this year in February, we had retired Supreme Court Justice Maureen O'Connor as our speaker, and we asked her how it is that, decades ago there was a decision that the funding system had to be changed, and yet nothing changed. It was still coming from taxes and local situations, and she had no good answer to that. I mean, it does seem like the legislature has been pretty much doing whatever they want for the last probably 10 years, and now it's suddenly gotten even worse. The good news, one of our people posted in chat that they got a great public education from Ohio, which used to be the cradle of the nation for education. That's a comforting thought. So go ahead, Bill, you wanted to say something. Well,
during the Strickland administration and during the time that the House was controlled by the Democrats, and I'm apolitical in this whole matter. I'm not getting into the politics of it, but this is just a fact that when the House was led by the Democrats and when Strickland was governor, we made tremendous progress, even in the worst recession in decades.
So, and I have a vested interest in being optimistic here because I'm in year one. If I start cynical, then there's nowhere to go.
That's right.
But I will say, one of the first things I did in my role is I started going to rural school districts and visiting schools and talking to students and teachers and parents and principals and superintendents because because I graduated from Cincinnati Public, I've worked a lot in Cincinnati Public Schools. I grew up in the suburbs as a kid. I sort of understood those two types of schools, but wanted to understand rural schools. And what I found almost immediately was that those schools and those communities face so many of the same challenges that our urban districts face. And it's borne out in the metrics, but when you actually go talk to people, it's the same challenges in terms of what poverty is doing. It's the same challenges in terms of not enough adults in the building, about student-teacher ratios, underfunding. And in the assembly, in the legislature, the vast majority of legislators represent either rural or urban school districts that have very similar challenges. And I really believe, and I've now spoken to a number of those representatives, they do believe in public education. They all went to public schools. Their sisters and their cousins and their brothers are all teachers and in public schools. And so it's, I think, less about whether they care, whether they intend to destroy public education. They do not. But we need to give them a little bit of a optimistically political will, cynically political fear, that they actually have to deliver for their constituents. I tell this to them all to their face, and I have good relationships with them, but the Speaker of the House and the chair of the Finance Committee, so the two most powerful people in the House, come from Appalachia. I have been to both of their school districts. They are struggling, really struggling. Their students are hungry. They have hunger issues in school in a way that we actually don't have in urban areas because we have 100% free and reduced lunch. And it is an unbelievable shame that in a year where we had a historic $8 billion surplus in the budget, that the students who go to school in the districts represented by the most powerful people in the legislature don't have enough to eat. And that is, and I don't say this, I mean, obviously that's not a good look for them, the speaker and the chair, but I will tell you, they agree with me. If they had their way, those kids would have gotten the funding for school lunch, and they would have gotten more funding for public education, and we would not have funded private schools the way we did. And so there is a caucus that exists that is the majority of people, certainly in the House and potentially in the Senate. The Senate president made this his number one issue. He's made it his number one issue for the last 3 years. He is the most powerful person in the legislature. So it's not all, everyone wants to destroy public education. There is a real group of people that want to invest in public education, and it's the majority of legislators. And so we just have to build that coalition who's willing to vote together on it. But it does exist.
But so do the speaker of the House, the chair of the Finance Committee, will they speak up and let their feelings and their beliefs be known, unlike the national legislators who are afraid to say anything?
I've been on a number of panels with the chair of the Finance Committee, and here's what I'll tell you. You would not know when he talks about education what party he was. He talks about his family, that he's got 5 sisters and they're all teachers. He talks about how committed he is to public education. So he is willing to say those things publicly. I think that my issue with him, which I've said publicly, is when you triage, you got to be willing to fight pretty hard for these things. These are the things you go to the mat for. These are not the things you compromise on. You don't compromise on school hunger. So that's, I think, where some of, but I think you would find that you really agree with a lot of what he believes on public education. And he does say it.
Yeah. Well, I love the fact that you're an optimist. I mean, because it's just too depressing to look at it and believe everything that you see. I mean, we have to think that it can be better, that it's not going to get worse. Otherwise, we'd all want to give up. So I like the fact that you're an optimist, but I also understand exactly what Katie's saying and Bill, and it's very unnerving to see what's going on, not only in our state, in a lot of other states, and in the national.
May I say something else?
Sure.
In 1958 or 1959, when I first started teaching, I heard a legislator say, we didn't do very good for education this year, and this was at a county-wide teachers meeting. But the next time around, we're going to fix this thing. Now, I spent 16 years at the State Department of Education working with the legislature. I was in the State House every day. That was one of my jobs to represent the State Board of Education. And after 16 years, I just kind of gave up for the legislature to really fix the buildings, provide adequate funding. And so I made a decision to leave the State Department of Education and work with the group that was suing the state. And now we got 1,200 new buildings that we wouldn't have had if they hadn't been for the litigation. I think the only hope is litigation. Now, I appreciate the representative's optimism, but I've been around for about 6 decades working in education, and every for the first 5 or so decades, I had optimism that they're going to finally fix it, but they haven't, and now they've made it worse with the voucher and charter industry.
So Bob Whalen says, do they not understand that vouchers are very harmful to public education? Very simple question.
Well, you see, what's not really out in the open is that the puppet masters for the voucher industry, their whole scheme is to get rid of a viable public education system and privatize this. There's one party that wants to privatize everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Not only prisons and parks, they want to drill on public property. In the United States, we're losing thousands of acres every day of public lands to private entrepreneurs. We're losing public forest. They're drilling on public forest. All kinds of mining on public forest. There's a big move on the part of at least one party in this state to privatize all the public institutions, and once the public schools fall to privatization, then you're going to see the other the public institutions fall to privatization. They're taking their playbook from Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of England, there back during the Reagan administration, where she said there isn't anything such as society. There isn't anything such as the common good. And there are a lot of these people hanging around today that want to get rid of the common good. They don't care anything about the common good. All they care about is making another $1 billion.
So I guess the bottom line is what we have to make sure we do is vote in senators and representatives that we know are supporters of Cincinnati Public School. And, we did make some progress, but there's a lot more to be made. And I like to be optimistic. And as Danny said, go ahead, say what you said, Danny.
Oh, in the chat?
Yeah.
I really think that a rural, particularly an urban Appalachian coalition on public education is the path here. And I think they have overstepped on this issue, like on so many others, and they're pretty uncomfortable out on that limb. No one in Appalachia, no one likes hearing that the state is spending double on private school students than on public school students,
Right.
because they don't know anyone who goes to private school. And so I do think there's a lane there that I'm gonna at least I think there is, and I'm gonna find out.
So
that's one of my goals.
So do you think that, as Bill said, that legislation is the best best path forward to.
Bill said litigation, but he has,
Litigation.
as
That's
he
what I meant,
noted,
litigation, yeah.
he has earned that legislative cynicism, and I haven't earned it yet.
But
I want to raise a point, if I could. Susan, several of us on this call went to a session with our Cincinnati Public School Board candidates. It was they were telling us their positions. But the thing that was interesting was every single candidate was united in the concern about not just the money that is going to the public schools, but the students who are not going to be in the public school buildings anymore, and how that all ripples out. Like when too many students start going into the private schools instead of the public, that what happens then? Do we have to close the public schools? Do we have to consolidate? How do you staff them? How do you have teachers for fewer students? And there's a question in here, is you wonder, the legislature, I would like to believe that some of these people are reasonably intelligent. Did they not think through those unintended consequences? That it isn't just about money, it's about bodies in the seats, teachers in the school. How do you keep your schools open if there's no students there? And I mean, does that have to, all three of you, was a question to all three of you, does that have to devolve before the legislature understands that this is not working and we need to fix it? Anybody?
I can't, go ahead, Dani.
Go ahead, Katie.
Well, you know what? Before you ask that question, we have a chance in 24 to get on the ballot a anti-gerrymandering citizen agenda. So in other words, citizens, not politicians, to change this gerrymandering. So this is, you said the last 10 years is when all this nonsense has really come to the forefront. Well, we need to basically take back our state and make sure that we have the right kind of representatives in our state and in our house, because that is what we need to do to take back what's going on. Because I have a fear, folks, if they can take a citizen-led constitutional amendment from 1953 and throw it into a budget bill to destroy it, what else are they going to be capable of doing? We have just worked really hard on passing issue 1. Are they going to do that the next opportunity they have in a budget hearing or in a budget bill? So we need to be really on our toes, everybody, and get this gerrymandering taken care of in Ohio so that we actually have the kind of representation in our legislature that we all need.
Dani?
Yeah. So I know this is technically a nonpartisan group, so I'll try and give you to answer your question. I'll try and give you what some of my colleagues would say or have said to me in this space, which is that they believe we are already spending an astronomical amount on education, on public education, and we are not seeing results. That math scores continue to decline, reading scores continue to decline, and that instead of continuing to throw money at a system that is clearly, and again, this is what they say. I want to be very clear. This is not what I think. But
we get it. Yeah.
Well, it's being recorded, so I just like to put some caveats on. That instead of continuing to throw money at a system that is not functioning well, we should instead invest in a charter school network or give kids the opportunity to go to private schools, because maybe that will catalyze the public schools to recognize through the power of competition that they should start doing better. I think it assumes a lot of things. It assumes that they're not doing the best they can with what they've got. It assumes something fundamentally flawed, and it assumes that private schools and charter schools can do it any better with that population. But that is, I think, a pretty fair assessment of what they believe and what they would respond to, Janet, to the question you posed. My response to it is actually usually that we are so far from spending the amount of money that would allow you to make that argument plausibly in public schools. We don't even have close to the student-teacher ratios that we would need to have to be able to then claim that the system doesn't work. And we know that because we can see the student-teacher ratios in the extremely high-performing, highly funded public schools in the wealthiest suburbs. And those students come from often college-educated parent backgrounds, right? They grew up with books. They don't have the same level of trauma in their neighborhoods. So we actually need to be spending significantly more per pupil in urban districts like Cincinnati than we are in Indian Hill or Wyoming. And yet we are spending less. And so until we get to some meaningful, like, I don't think money is the only solution, but it is a necessary part of the solution that we are not there yet. But that is, I just wanted to give you a sense of what the back and forth is. That's often the back and forth.
Appreciate that. And we have a couple of other questions. Sarah asks.
Could I pick up on something there?
Okay, sure.
You know, this is before, this is a little history since you all are so much younger than I am. But back in 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik, right? At least you've read about it. I was around at that time.
Well, so were a lot of us.
Well, and the response to the federal government at that time was, okay, let's help the public schools with math and science. And so they provided funding for math and science instruction and teacher improvement in math and science in the public system. The same thing happened in 1914 or 1917 with vocational education, bolster up the public system. Then Reagan comes along, issues that Nation at Risk bogus report that condemned public education, condemned teachers in the public system. Then in 1990, there's the Brookings Institution hired a couple of guns to write a book, and what they said was that the problem with public education is school boards, because in the democratic process, the school boards can't move fast enough because they have to listen to the public, and so we ought to subject the education to the market forces. Then Bush 41, he picked up on that and wanted to have a voucher for every kid. And even Clinton come along and he started the federal money for charter school startups. And then Bush 43 came along with the abominable No Child Left Behind, and all the testing and all the firing principals and teachers and restructuring schools, and then Obama came along with his education secretary Arne Duncan and made that law worse, and teachers had to spend much of their time testing kids rather than teaching kids. And so we've had decades of mismanagement at the political level of school district or of public education. So the bottom line of all of this is that if, in fact, rural legislators, and in Texas, they don't have vouchers because the rural legislators have fought off the governor. And the governor's called four legislatures. He brought the legislature back 4 times to try to force vouchers on the rural area. Now, if Ohio rural legislators, don't want vouchers, then they need to start speaking up. I haven't heard any of them speaking up. They're all afraid of Senate President Hofmann.
Thank you, Bill, for that input. I'm going to ask these last couple of questions. Sarah asks, is the governor's rationale for controlling educational policy and the administration of the Department of Education and Workforce to expedite the carrying out of policy and improve student academic performance and school attendance? legitimate. That's his rationale. Is it legitimate? What do you think?
Well,
Katie, you're
Yeah.
muted.
Yeah, Katie, I think was going to say something.
Okay. So several years ago, they, at the 11th hour, they put in an academic distress commission. They said they were going to take over some of these low performing schools. And they decided that they were going to take over them and they were going to make a great, wonderful thing. Their magic wand was going to work. Guess what? It didn't move the arrow at all. So in other words, they're saying, well, we're going to go in and we're going to do this. We're going to take over these school districts and we're going to get it done. And they did not get it done. So just because you want to do something quickly and fast is not going to get it done. I will make a comment about the most recent state report card. When we had the report on that, and everybody's saying doom and gloom, the math scores are going down. No, that is not what the report card data said. That post-pandemic, the scores are rising all across the state. More than 75% of the school districts in Ohio moved the arrow forward. So this whole thing about saying the districts are not doing well is a lie. And if you will really look at that state report card and what they're talking about, it is a true indication of the wealth of a district. It is not an indication of what is being taught.
Okay.
moving
Thank you,
moving the State Department of Education, the governor's office, is not about improving education. It's about control.
I think that was kind of the way I felt when I first read that. What do you think, Danny? You have any feelings on that?
This is one where Katie and Bill are going to know way more about it than I do. I will say there's a lot of complaints about. It's one of these things. It's the same pattern that happens with public schools. It happens with everything. If you underfund it, it will not perform optimally. And so there is a certain level of intense cynicism of underfunding something intentionally and then complaining that it's not functioning optimally. It's what we do with public transit. It's what we do with public education. And it's what we do with a lot of government departments. It's what we do with jobs and family services. And so we say ODE takes weeks to get back to schools. Schools call and they don't get an answer. The department isn't functioning well. We need to take it over. That was the argument. Well, we're not investing in the department. The department is understaffed. And so it becomes a bit of a straw man but that was the argument. The argument was that the department is not itself functioning well and needs to be overhauled.
Well,
you can look at the juvenile justice system right now as a great example of being underfunded. But anyway, there's one more question here. What public good is done with public money being given to families who are already paying tuition to private schools? Isn't it a zero-sum game where, in these cases, people with the means to pay for private schools are getting bonus money at the expense of the poor?
The poor are being taxed to support the rich.
Well, that's true.
Yeah,
I think there's some validity in that. Anyone who's paying taxes would feel that way.
Yeah. Okay.
There's another question too, Susan, down below. Did you see the new one from Brian? Maybe I think he sent it to me. Another question is, this is directed toward Representative Isaacsohn. Do you believe that spending more money to underperforming school districts to remedy the socioeconomic issues outside of the school walls will improve those schools' performance? So to simplify, let's take into consideration some of the socioeconomic issues that children in public schools have, certainly far more frequently than children in private schools do. And if we put money into remedying those problems, will we then see an improved performance in the schools?
Definitely. But I just want to put this in some context for people. these are schools which have 90 to 100% of their students living in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
The entire school, with
Yep.
all of the issues and the trauma that comes with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I spent a lot of time at Springer School this year because they were needing some state changes. And it's an incredible place. I don't know if you know it. It's a school for people with, well, most people probably know what Springer does.
Yeah.
Springer, the tuition that students get at Springer ranges from $10,000 to close to $30,000 a year from the state. And the school probably spends about $35,000 to $38,000 per kid. So it's about a little more than about two times what a public school would spend in a regular public school. And when I asked a student there, I had lunch with them, and one of the students said, I love it here. I felt I was so lost in my public school before I got here. I said, well, what do you love? What's making it so great? And he said, well, here, when I fall behind in math, I never actually fall behind because there's always an adult in the room who catches me up. And all I could think was every kid should have that.
Mm-hmm.
That should be basic. But to have enough adults who can handle the social and emotional issues going on in our public schools and be there to help students when they fall behind academically, to have enough adults in the school to do that, it would cost double what we are spending.
Yeah.
But imagine if every kid in every school had a 1-to-1 adult ratio, they'd learn better, and so it's just a question of what are our priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So true.
But I think I had an interesting experience on this past Tuesday night. I was in a meeting with the principal for Withrow High School, which is maybe half a mile from Springer. And I was astounded. I'm sorry I didn't write down the exact amount, but there's an unusually large number of children. This is junior high and high school at Withrow who are unhoused, who do not have permanent housing. And one of the comments he was making, he had come to ask us for some support for various programs, is that it's hard to teach a child who, is living out of a car and doesn't know for sure where he's going to be sleeping at the end of the day. Do you really want to go home and write your English essay? And to put this in context, I did my student teaching at Withrow back in, I'm old, 1973. And it was a far different place then. It was a strong public school, but the population was not perhaps as needy as the current population is, based on what the principal is telling us about the children in poverty. I mean, they're trying to raise money to provide the kids with food bags to take home over the Christmas holiday because they won't be getting their lunches at school. And that was one of the programs he had come to ask our neighborhood council for help with. So with these kind of systemic issues, and this isn't just Cincinnati public schools. I'm sure it's true in Columbus, it's in Cleveland, it's in any metropolitan school district that has the inner city school students. How do I think that's the socioeconomic problem we're trying to solve, the stability of these kids. And then you would see these kids performing like their peers do. So is there any thoughts, any answers to that? Does the legislature take any of that into consideration when they're making all these nice new laws and policies?
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
And it has to be more for any of it to work. But that is a fact. So many of our kids are homeless more and more all the time. And that affects everything. But it's a little bit late. I want to thank all of our panelists so much. We appreciate you being with us. We've learned a lot. I'd like to thank the program committee, Jeff, Janet, Lori Frank, Sarah Gideons, and Jan Seymour for helping to plan this program. We have so much more to learn, but basically what we need to do is keep up with this stuff, support Dani and all the legislators that actually are working for us to do what we need to be done, because we know there are some that aren't. So we've got to support those that are. We've got to be vocal. We've got to speak up. And if you read David Pepper's book, you'll know that, that's what we have to do, is be vocal. So thank you all again. And by the way, don't forget, Women's City Club's national speaker is March 22nd. And we're having Jen White, who is National Public Radio morning show, A1. And we'd love to see you at that. So thank you all so much. Appreciate it. And look forward to seeing you soon.
And I'd like to, real quick thing, we will be doing more. Katie mentioned the situation with the amendment to end the gerrymandering. That is something Women's City Club is very much on top of. We did do a nice program with the Supreme Court Justice back in February, and we will, as soon as that group is ready to present, we will be doing a program to look into that. Please look at Women's City Club website, woman, WOMANS, cityclub.org, and check us out. We do a lot of good programs. We hope you come back for more. Even if we don't have answers, it's good to ask the questions. I see Judy put into chat that it's not just urban schools who have poverty issues. It's an issue everywhere. So there's so much good work we can all do, but keep checking in with Women's City Club. We're trying to do our part too.
Right. You need to know that we have a lot of male members, and we'd love to have you join, Dani and Bill and anybody else. So, and Sister Judy, I just have to say hello to you. I haven't seen you for so long. It's so good to see you. Sister Judy, you ran Venice on Vine, and so good to see you.
Yeah. And when Susan mentions male members, I mean, let's point out that our president is a man.
That's
so
right.
we definitely do welcome male members. Our name is 100 and I've lost track. It's 115.
108.
108. Thank you. I was an English major, not a math major. It's 108 years old. We talk about changing our name, but it's hard to let go of a name you've had for over a century. But we are not just, we are men, we are women, we are young people, we are old people. We are from the suburbs, the city. We are everywhere, and we are vocal. So join us and help us do our good work for good things.
All right. Thank you all so much. Good night.